Alastair, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Bennett, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's start by talking about your career. You studied law at university, you were an associate to a federal court judge and also a management consultant with Accenture. You then became the manager of the Australian Centre for Disability Law. Why did you want that role, and why was it important to work at an organisation for people with disabilities?
When I reflect on my time back then, Bennett, I remember thinking I wanted to give back more strongly to the disability community. Prior to that, I'd done a number of volunteer roles, or was doing a number of volunteer roles in the deaf community and in the wider disability community. So I'd finished with Accenture, where I had a wonderful grounding in management consulting, information technology, and a lot of the issues around how to manage people. So I felt I was ready for a management role. So I took on that role because of my ambition to give back to the community through leadership and or management roles. I also remember reflecting on the time that I had a law degree and I understood how the law worked, and the Australian Centre for Disability Law provides advice and information to people who are disabled and experiencing discrimination. So it was important for me to know that there were many people out there who didn't know the law, who would need help and support to understand the law and to use the law to hopefully address the discrimination that they were experiencing. So I saw this as a great combination of using my law degree, even though I was not a practicing lawyer, drawing on my experience with Accenture, the management consulting firm, and also drawing on my past and current volunteer roles in the disability community. So it was a wonderful experience.
You said it was important for you to give back to the disability community. Why was that so important to you?
When I look back on my childhood and young adulthood, I was very lucky. I was given lots of opportunity. My parents were very determined to give me the best start in life through education. I was born on my father and mother were living on a sheep farm in the southeast of South Australia. When they discovered I was deaf at the age of 18 to 24 months, we were living far away from the best educational opportunity, that is Adelaide. So they moved to Adelaide and they sent me to a mainstream private school where there was support for deaf kids throughout the school. Importantly, I was hanging out with non-disabled kids who weren't deaf. So I was learning to stand on my own 2 feet, so to speak. Having said that, when I look back, it was an extremely rich and loving childhood, and I was given opportunities all the way through school and into university. So I know that that's not the case for many. So I wanted to look for roles where I could change the bigger picture, where I knew the bigger picture was failing disabled people, and so therefore a role like working with the Australian Centre for Disability Law was a perfect way to give back.
You later spent several years as the Disability Discrimination Commissioner. What was so rewarding about that position, and what are you most proud of achieving in the role?
Bennett, there were many, many things about that role that was rewarding. Firstly, it was a privilege and an honour and a bit of a surprise to be appointed to the role. I remember thinking at the time, perhaps I'm too young. And that's something I also learned. The imposter syndrome is quite big when it comes to something like being appointed to such an important role at a relatively young age. And that's something I've worked through. I was appointed for a reason. I was clearly able to do the role. I was clearly appointed by those who saw value and credibility in my appointment. So it was rewarding to know that I was there for a reason, and I wanted to make sure that I discharged my duties as best I could, knowing that I had huge expectations in the disability community. I knew that change would be long and hard, and it still is. I knew that if every day I could make a small impact or a small difference to either one person's life or many lives of those in the disability community, I knew I was doing something right. When I think about what did I achieve in the time there, I was there for 3 years, and for me, when I look back, I reflect mostly on the importance of keeping a spotlight on the most important issues for the disability community. And one issue was the issue of violence against disabled people. 2 years into my role, I produced a report called A Future Without Violence, which looked at the way that we respond to when something happens to a disabled person through violence. 6 months later, or 8 to 10 months later, we saw the formation of the Disability Royal Commission. And the full title, of course, is the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. So that's a great example of keeping a spotlight on the issue.
You were, of course, one of the commissioners for that Royal Commission, and we'll talk about that later in the conversation. But I wanted to shift to your board career now. We mentioned some of the board positions you've had, but what was your first board role and why did you want to be a director?
Bennett, my first board role was with the former Royal South Australian Deaf Society in South Australia, where I spent my childhood and young adulthood. I was a new graduate in law, so a couple of years out of law school. I'd been living overseas for a few years, and I'd come back to Adelaide looking for my next career opportunity. And at the same time, I was approached to join the Deaf Society, or the Royal South Australian Deaf Society Board. And at the time, there were very few deaf professionals. That's not the case now. It's great to see the increased numbers. And also, there were very, very few deaf people in Australia at the time with a law degree. So I knew that I had something specific to offer. And of course, I was a member of the South Australian deaf community. I was a relatively new member because I'd grown up in what we call a mainstream setting where my parents wanted me to be part of the hearing world. And I was finding more and more that I had a deaf identity. So learning sign language, becoming part of the deaf community. So being appointed to that role, I saw as another great opportunity to combine the fact that I had a law degree that many people didn't have, wanting to give back to the community, and also to start learning what it's like to be a board director. I think ultimately I knew long term there would be more and more board roles. And so at the relatively young age of 26, I think it was, 27, I became a board member.
26, 27 is very young to be a director at any organisation. What advice do you have for other people who are just beginning their own board careers? And how can they be an effective director in those first few board meetings?
Oh, well, Bennett, when I look back, I know I made mistakes. I know I was young and perhaps naive in some ways, and I was in a hurry to change the world. And I remember thinking and feeling frustrated at the rate of change or at the pace of change when I thought things needed to happen more quickly because I saw the problem that the deaf community were experiencing, and I wanted to change that through my role. What I would say to people who are now beginning their career as a board director is, remember, you are there for a purpose. Clearly, a colleague or colleagues saw value in your appointment, or the shareholders saw value in your appointment, so stay true to your purpose. That said, take your time. Take your time to learn about how the board works. Sit back for your first few meetings and just listen, observe what's been said, what's been done, the culture, how does the CEO interact with the board, how does the chair the meeting, and so forth. And if you can, seek a one-on-one meeting with the chair before you commence your board appointment, or as soon as you can in the early days and months of your role. So for me, I think it's really important when I reflect on my own journey is I wish I'd taken more time to just sit back and appreciate that eventually your true purpose will come to the fore when you know why you're there and you can work more effectively with other board members.
You're now a very experienced board member. You've had a number of roles. You've been doing this for quite a long time. You're not 26 or 27 anymore. What have you learned about being a director over that time? And How do you think you've grown as a board member and as a leader?
I know I've learned a lot over those years, and I think importantly, I've learned that a board is like a team. So from my management experience, when you support teams as a team leader or the manager or as a CEO, a board is also a team. You've got to be able to draw effectively on the strengths of individual board members. You've got to take the time to build the board as a team so that they can perform at a high rate. For me also, doing professional development is also important. So 2 years ago, in March 2023, I did the company director's course. And again, part of my professional development has been a recognition that there's always going to be lifelong learning. Prior to that, I did a Master's of Business Administration, and I've also done various leadership courses over the years, including last year, the McKinsey & Co. Executive Leadership Program. So for me, it's important to not only keep working at your own board career, but also taking time to step out and do some professional development opportunities. I also think I've learned that the relationship between the board and the CEO is really important. And I've learned that you do have to, at times, or most of the time, separate governance and management. Of course, the CEO is important to being a conduit. There may be, at times, a little bit of overlap between those two roles, but essentially you have to trust and respect the CEO to do the management side of things. Having said that, it is also important to learn how to challenge the CEO through probing questions, reading your board papers, identifying if there are gaps in your knowledge, seeking expertise from individual board members if necessary, working with the chair, particularly if there is a big issue around those organisational change, such as restructure, or if there are funding threats, or if there are threats for the organisation in terms of reputation. So for me, the learnings I've had there is a board is like working with a team in the workplace. We can draw on each other's strengths, but also we can draw on each other collectively.
You mentioned working with the chief executive. You've been on both sides of that relationship. You've been an executive, you've been a board member and a chair. You've also had statutory roles, like when you were Disability Discrimination Commissioner. How have you balanced all of those positions at the same time?
Pretty well, I think, because I saw opportunities to learn from both settings, from my management role as well as being on board. So I saw a crossover, learning things in the workplace that I could apply strategically as a board member, and also from being a board position, knowing that there are things that, in terms of strategy and strategy implementation, that might be useful in the workplace. When I became a commissioner, I stepped down from all my board roles because I felt it was important to be as independent as possible. And I think for me, that meant that I could have a really blank slate when I began as Disability Discrimination Commissioner, even though I was still drawing on the knowledge and experience I had in my previous role. I thought it was important to be seen as independent and not a part of any other organisation. That was a bit difficult for me to do at the time because I really enjoyed the mixture of board roles and leadership and management roles. Having said that, as I wanted to stress to myself, I wanted to be true to myself and also practice what I preach, try and be as independent as possible in that statutory role. And then, of course, when I became a commissioner with the Disability Royal Commission, it was equally as important to be as independent as possible. Since I've stopped being a commissioner, I've slowly but surely taken up a few board and advisory committee roles.
You've been the chair or president at several organisations. Different people interpret that role in different ways. What's your answer? How do you interpret the chair role, and what do you think makes a chair or president effective?
When I became president or chair, I knew that it was very important to do a number of things. Get to know the board members. So I arranged one-on-one meetings with each board member for example, with the Deaf Society. I thought it was important to get to know them not only as people, but also why were they on the board? What was their motivation? What expertise and strength did they bring? So I found that a very valuable lesson in connecting one-on-one. I also found that those people really appreciated being asked to meet one-on-one, appreciated me asking what they wanted to see done better from a board perspective. So I remember at the time thinking this is time consuming, but also ultimately it will pay off dividend. And I did notice that from after having those one-on-one meetings, board members were much more receptive to my chairing of the meeting. There was still difficult conversation to have. Having said that, because I've made that personal connection with the individuals around the boardroom, I was able to really bring out almost the humanity of the decision that we were trying to make. I've also been chair of, for example, as you know, the Disability Advisory Council of New South Wales. That was an important role because it provides advice to the Minister for Disabilities here in New South Wales. It also the council is made up of people from a wide range of backgrounds, both from a disability themselves or not having a disability, but perhaps a family member who has a disability. So a wide range of expertise, experience, and motivation as to why they're on the council. That meant that I had to acknowledge that there was a wide range of views, particularly from people with disabilities, which I did not have much experience or knowledge about. So again, connecting with those people individually was important to me. I also wanted to make sure that they felt that their contribution were important. So I always made time in the meeting for everybody, if they wanted to have their say. So I think bringing this to a point of what have I learned over the years in being a chair or a president is people do look to you for leadership. People do expect you to make decisions ultimately rather than prevaricating or procrastinating, but ultimately they appreciate being able to connect with the chair or president.
You mentioned the Disability Advisory Council of New South Wales, and it had board members from many different backgrounds, many different experiences. How difficult was it to bring all those people together as one board?
Bennett, it was very important to make sure I gave people the time to talk about what they wanted to. And yes, that does take time and effort. But ultimately, when people feel that they've not only been heard, but their views have been incorporated into the thinking, what really is important is to then try and work out what's the commonality of all this. And one commonality, of course, is, ongoing discrimination or prejudice against disabled people. That's something that's very common amongst the disability community. It's also important we have to say, we've talked about this a lot. We do need to make some decisions. Here are some ideas. Here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? So engage people in the decision-making process, ultimately knowing that at times there might be some difficult decisions to be made, or there may be decisions that not everybody is entirely happy with, but it will be a long-term process.
Let's talk now about representation in the boardroom. We often hear the phrase, nothing about us without us. That's an important expression. You've held many leadership roles in deaf and disability organisations. Why does representation at the top matter so much?
It really does matter because we're still not seeing lots of disabled leaders and disabled people in the boardroom. We're not seeing them in Parliament. There are a few, only one or two, who are openly disabled in our federal parliament, for example, very few in the state and territory government. So we're still seeing a lack of visibility of disabled people in leadership roles in board. We've had a lot of inquiries, and of course, we've mentioned the Disability Royal Commission. We are still not good at making sure that the boardroom is accessible, that the boardroom is welcoming, but also we're not putting in the right access and support that disabled people need to be able to perform their duties. I think what also needs to happen is a culture. So the organisation itself, and of course the chair and the CEO play a vital role in establishing and implementing the culture of the organisation. So we have seen time and time again disabled people come into an organisation and they're not able to perform or progress in their career because the right access is not there. So what needs to happen is people need to have a more open mind to doing things differently, putting in place the right support, but also acknowledging that disabled people themselves do have something to offer. And I should also be really clear, even though I've got a lot of experience in disability, I'd also like to think that I've got some pretty good experience in other areas, such as I've had training in board governance, I've done lots of leadership courses. So I'd like to think I also bring other skills and experience to the board table. And I think that's something that often non-disabled people don't see in disabled people. So we've got to be really careful not to go down that path of tokenism or tick a box. Well, yes, we've now got a disabled person on our board. We don't need to do any more. The challenge is to include them in the decision making, include them in the board discussion in the right way.
Many organisations, many boards want to be more inclusive towards people with disabilities, but they might not know where to start. So, what are some practical and effective first steps that boards and organisations can take?
It's a really great question, Bennett, because often people say, I'm afraid that I'm not doing the right thing by disabled people. The first thing is to acknowledge it can be done. There may be some mistakes made along the way. I've made mistakes myself in my journey in terms of being a board member. There's a range of things. Firstly, mentoring, and the AICD has a great mentoring program in place. So that's one way where we can bring in more disabled people into those mentoring programs. It's great to see the growing number of disabled people doing AICD courses, and I'm very grateful to the AICD for doing that in partnership with others. What's also important is giving disabled people the space to grow and flourish just like any other board member would. Ask them what they need. Don't assume. Don't be afraid to say, look, I've noticed that you might need some more support. How can we provide support? Most disabled people know how to ask for the right support. There are still many, particularly those who are at the beginning of their board career, who might need some more support. Having said that, ultimately, disabled people themselves know what they need, know what they the right access for them to be able to perform their board duties effectively. Other practical things that companies or organisations can do is acknowledge that we have a problem, talk to disabled people, representative organisation, learn from the inquiries, and I know we'll talk a bit more about the Disability Royal Commission in a minute, but also at the end of the day, acknowledge that the number of disabled people in board or in government roles is very small, and that needs to change.
As you said, that the number of people with disabilities in board roles is small. They're underrepresented. They're also underrepresented in executive positions and in a number of sectors. Where does the blockage occur and how can it be addressed?
One thing that we've been talking a lot about in the disability community recently is also acknowledging that there are invisible disabilities. Somebody may come into a room or be on a webinar and they might not appear to have a disability. So it's important to acknowledge that a number of things, that there are disabled people who do not look obviously disabled, but also they may not want to disclose that they have a disability because of fear of prejudice or discrimination. And it does happen. It happens daily. When someone discloses, for example, that they may have a mental health or a psychosocial disability or that they are neurodivergent, they have experienced discrimination. So naturally, they don't want to disclose until they feel that they are in an environment that will be safe, that will support them, and that will know how to provide the right support for them to be an effective board member. So that's one thing for people to think about. The other thing to think about is how do you build a culture of inclusion itself? And that that can only happen when you've got disabled people in the room. So, as you said, nothing about us without us. Having disabled people in the room, part of the decision-making process, is really important. And that's where I've seen it work well. When a CEO or a board chair says, look, I know we have a problem. How can we make it work? And I just want to reflect very briefly, Bennett, if I can, my interview with the federal court judge who I ultimately became the associate to. One of the things he asked me in the interview was, he said, I know that you're deaf, you have a hearing impairment. How can we make it work in the courtroom? And that was a very refreshing approach when previously in other interviews with other judges, there had been the attitude of, this can't be done. Oh, you're deaf. I can't see any way that it will work. Whereas this judge, John Von Duster, said, how can we make it work? And he himself in the interview started to come up with some solutions, such as a flashing light, so that if I needed to speak to him, he could press the button on his desk and I would see it flash on the associate desk below. So all these, it might seem simple now, but when you look back in the mid-1990s, a culture of inclusion was still decades away. So that's the really important thing to consider.
Let's talk now about the Royal Commission. As we said, you were one of the commissioners for the Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with disability. The final report was released in 2023. Not all of our listeners will have read the full report. So what were some of the Commission's key findings and recommendations for boards?
The overarching theme and the overarching finding was Australia is failing disabled people in mainstream settings. Mainstream settings are just not accessible. They're not welcoming and they're not allowing disabled people to be part of those settings. Education, employment, health, it's a very long list. So we came up with a set of recommendations to say to mainstream settings, you need to improve. You need to be more accessible and inclusive of disabled people. And that was the overarching finding that the Royal Commission made. I will just briefly touch upon something where not all commissioners could agree on. And that commissioners could not agree on the fact that for as long as you maintain what we call, or what I call, segregated settings, such as where you have disabled kids in special schools or in shelter workshops or in group homes, for as long as you maintain those settings and make no attempt to dismantle them over time and ultimately eliminate them, you will have no incentive to improve mainstream settings. So that was where commissioners could not agree. And so a couple of us, or a number of commissioners, myself included, had a very strong vision that a more inclusive Australia means no more segregated settings. Some of the recommendations that would be relevant to board members are particularly for those that run disability service providers. And one of the key recommendations was how to embed human rights into your service delivery. So person-centered approach, acknowledging that every disabled person has autonomy. We made a lot of recommendations around supported decision-making, how to give the best support to a disabled person to make their own decision. Bernard, I had a very interesting exchange with one of the barristers for a service provider in one of our public hearings who said or suggested that people with intellectual disability may not be able to be board directors because it would not comply with the corporations law requirement that you be of sound mind. And that was a very interesting exchange. And some commissioners made the point in that hearing that there are already disabled people, particularly with intellectual disabilities, on board. They just need to be provided with the right support. So it can be done. For example, how many of us have read board materials such as financial materials and struggle to really understand the finances. Now, I'm one of those. So I rely on more professional development. I rely on the treasurer. I rely on staff providing that information in an easy to understand. So there are ways to make materials more accessible, and there are ways to make boardroom processes more supportive to include disabled people, including people with intellectual disabilities. So that was one sort of recommendation. And just a few others were around the having a Disability Rights Act. And that's a way of putting into domestic law the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And Australia hadn't done that yet. Yes, Australia has signed up to the convention, so it has said we are committed to making Australia more inclusive for disabled people. We haven't quite gotten there yet in terms of making that part of domestic law. So there were a lot more recommendations I could talk about. That said, they're the key ones that I would like my colleagues watching this podcast to consider. How do you make your own organisation, both your board and the organisation itself, more inclusive through embedding a human rights culture?
You've worked in the disability sector for a long time, and of course you have lived experience as well. But were there findings from the Royal Commission, or was there evidence in the Commission that you personally found surprising or confronting?
That's a really great question, and that's one that I know I'll be considering for the rest of my life. It was a privilege to be a commissioner on that Royal Commission. In particular, the hundreds of private sessions that I did. And private sessions were an opportunity for an individual or a group of maybe a family member and the disabled person to share their experiences with a commissioner, as the name implied, in private, but also in an entirely confidential setting. And even though I'd worked in disability for many years and had heard many, many shocking stories, very much aware of the depth of the problems and issues, I still found some of those sessions, and including what I heard in some of the public hearing, really confronting. And I think it was just a reminder of how far we still have to go, particularly in treating disabled people as second-class citizens or as non-human. And so I think I want to acknowledge that because people were brave and courageous and forthright in coming to the Royal Commission, I want to honour their experiences and their effort and the fact that they came to a Royal Commission. So that was confronting and a reminder to me of the work that still needs to be done. What was surprising was the fact that even though all commissioners were given the same information and the same evidence and the same opportunity to reflect on the issues, those without a disability still did not quite see or have a vision of a more inclusive Australia. They recommended, and people can read it in the report, that there are still they believe that there are still settings where disabled people are better off with their own kind. And for me, that was both surprising and confronting, but also a reminder on the need to keep having these conversations with a wide range of people.
Were those discussions difficult amongst the commissioners over those differing opinions?
I think due for a whole range of reasons, including the dynamics that were at play at commissioner level, ultimately, three of us decided to write our own section in, for example, education, inclusive education. As I said earlier, I believe that for as long as you maintain special schools, there will be no incentive to really reform and transform the mainstream educational setting. So ultimately, we realised that there was no point in having endless discussions internally amongst ourselves. Ultimately, we were appointed to produce the best report we could, and that meant, of course, splitting into different sections. So I think that was one way of acknowledging that disabled people have told us again and again, the problem is we want to be part of mainstream. We don't want to be in special schools. We don't want to be in sheltered workshops. So that was a solution. And also, I had recognised I was appointed to be an independent commissioner and could not be told by another commissioner what to say or do, or ultimately what to put in the final report. So that was the reason for why we split. And I think when I reflect on how that happened, it would have been wonderful to have had a final report that was unanimous in every single section. However, due to the dynamics that were at play, that was not the case. And disappointing, absolutely, but to me, a reminder of what still needs to happen. I guess in one way, Bennett, you could describe the six commissioners as a microcosm of the wider society. There are always going to be different views, and the most important thing is to keep having those conversations to get to, ultimately, I would hope, common ground.
I'll ask you one more question on the commission. It's now almost 2 years since the final report was released with its, I believe, 222 recommendations. How would you rate the response to that report and the recommendations by government, business, and the community since then?
I would rate overall the government response as lukewarm. I acknowledge that a lot of effort went into preparing the response, and I acknowledge that there's a lot of different stakeholders within government that have to contribute to the response. I would love to see the government be more proactive and acknowledging the underlying drivers. And that's what I sought to do with two of my colleagues in the commission, is to acknowledge that for as long as you separate disabled people away because you feel that they're not able to be part of the community, you will not have people in the community who are able to support them better, to understand them better, to also learn how to support them better. So that was very important. And I would like to see the government acknowledge more strongly the underlying drivers as to why we have people with disability experiencing violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. From a business perspective, it's great to see some more awareness of the need to reform system. We are seeing some green shoots, I suppose you could call them, amongst the business sector. They're getting better at embracing disability as part of their the need for a diverse workforce. The community itself, the Disability Royal Commission got some media during the time of the Royal Commission. We haven't seemed to have had much media since, other than a lot of attention on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS. And I think what needs to happen is the NDIS is a very important scheme, and it has to absolutely be sustainable. We really do need to focus more on mainstream. How can employers become better at including disabled people? How can mainstream schools get better at having disabled kids in the classroom with their non-disabled peers? So absolutely, for me, mainstream setting. So I hope that the government continues to recognise that mainstreaming is such an important issue, because that's where most of us are.
Alastair, that's been great. Thanks very much for joining us here on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Bennett. It's been a great pleasure.